Hello friends. Today we're going to talk about an important topic, and that is the issue of fiscal federalism. Now recently there was the CAG's report in the public domain about the delay in transfer of the GST compensation cess which was collected by the center to the states. And this issue strikes at the core of fiscal federalism and is an immensely important issue. Now, before we talk about fiscal federalism and its important, the implications of the delay in the transfers, etc., it would be useful to look at this political map and understand what is federalism. Now, before you get offended that, oh, this map shows the political disintegration of India or anything, it doesn't. It is a political cartoon which tells you about the importance of fiscal, which tells you about the importance of federalism in general. Now, federalism as an idea talks about the importance of self-rule and shared rule. Now, when we talk about self-rule and shared rule, the idea of self-rule relates to the autonomy of the states, to drive their own development policy. A state like Maharashtra, for example, may want to focus on manufacturing. A state like Himachal may want to focus on ecotourism. A state like Rajasthan may want to focus on other areas like mineral exploration. Or a state like Gujarat may want to focus on port infrastructure. So different states, defined by their geography, defined by their economic priorities, the prevailing demographic, may have different priorities. For example, a state like Bihar may want to focus more on issues such as providing education to their masses, or a state like Jharkhand may want to focus more on tribal development. So as many states are there driven by the geographical, the linguistic, the cultural and the socio-economic diversity in India, that may define the priorities of different states. So different states in India must have the freedom to pursue economic trajectory of their own, or to pursue a development model of their own. But at the same point of time, if every state starts driving itself in a very different direction, then the ship or the flotilla of a number of ships constituting the Indian state will actually fall apart. And to that extent, though autonomy of the states has to be ensured, but at the same point of time, what is necessary is to ensure that there is a central driver, who directs, and ensures that while retaining autonomy, all of them remain tied to each other or the center also. So while autonomy is important, there is a certain degree of interdependence also, because a manufacturing unit in Maharashtra will require the labor which comes from Bihar. Right? And it is in that context, interdependence of states is also there, and they cannot be completely isolated from the other units. And who is to ensure that effective coordination between different states is maintained? The center sitting in Delhi. And it is in this context that this is the relevance of the whole idea of federalism. Now, where does fiscal federalism fit in? What is its relation to things like the Finance Commission? And what is the talk about the CAG's report, etc.? Now, let's delve into this further. Before you talk about any specific issue, one must understand the broad idea under which any debate or discussion happens, and that is what we first need to understand. Now, there were two articles in the Hindu, the links for which you can find in the description below. The lead article that came on October 3rd, flagging cess non-transfer and its economic impact, by Govind Rao. M. Govind Rao has written immensely on fiscal federalism in the past also in the Hindu, and it's a very good article. Actually, you should read it. And the cesspool editorial on the CAG reports on center's account that came on the September 26th. Now, what is federalism and what is fiscal federalism? Federalism, I told you, is about self-rule of or autonomy of the states, but at the same point of time, shared rule under the center, right? But to ensure that states have autonomy, what do states first require? States have autonomy. What do states first require? Autonomy to pursue a developmental trajectory of their own. The states first require what? Availability of funds. If Gujarat wants to focus on building ports, then Gujarat must have funds for building or that kind of infrastructure, or if Bihar wants to, or Jharkhand wants to focus on some other developmental priority, it must have the funds to do so. So funds are very essential when it comes to if the states have to be effective in achieving their policy goals. Also, and so for this funds, and unless these funds are available, the states cannot be truly autonomous to pursue the trajectory or to pursue the growth trajectory. Now, the another thing, however, is that small states, say like a Manipur or like a Nagaland or like Himachal, may have less revenue generation on their own. And for this and for their development, they may require revenue transfer coming from other areas also to ensure regional equitable regional development also. So small states with less revenue may also require additional funds. But at the same point of, and that is one issue. Another thing is, for federalism to be really effective, one of the things is that we have a distribution of the central list, the state list, and the concurrent list. Now, the major developmental activities today are under which list? The central list, the state list, or the concurrent list? If you know the description well, you would know the major developmental activities are mentioned under the state list. Let me give you the example of maybe just 2-3 simple things, like health. Health is a state list topic or a central list? It's a state list topic. Primary education, is it a state list topic? Yes, it is a state list topic. When you talk about law and order, is it in center or in state list? Again, in the state list. So the states have the major developmental responsibilities. The states have the major developmental responsibilities. The center also has important responsibilities like foreign policy, security of the state, etc. But the major developmental responsibilities are with the states, and for this they need a huge amount of funds. But under the fiscal setup of India, the major taxation powers today, and especially the major taxation powers, are with the center. And it is in this context, if the major revenue is being collected by the center, it has to be shared with the states. Now, which is the authority which determines the formula on the basis of which revenue sharing happens between center and states? Which is that authority? It is the Finance Commission, right? And the Finance Commission itself is a constitutional authority. You may all have heard about the Finance Commission also, and federalism is thus the idea of retaining the autonomy of the states even while remaining interdependent on each other. And federalism can never be practiced without what? Fiscal autonomy, right? And so thus the authority, and thus the authority which actually is going to ensure that the revenue collected by the center is shared with the states, which is that authority? That is the Finance Commission, right? Now, that is which authority? The Finance Commission. Now, so if that is the case, then Finance Commission is the authority which is tasked with ensuring effective fiscal federalism, or with ensuring that states have enough revenue available to them for their developmental needs. Now, it is the Finance Commission which is itself a constitutional authority. You may have read about it in polity, etc., right? And it is this Finance Commissions whose responsibilities actually go in the direction of the vertical distribution and the horizontal distribution of revenue. Now, what do we mean by this vertical and horizontal distribution? Well, very simply that let me just explain you with the example. The 13th Finance Commission had recommended that of the total revenue which is collected by the central government, please understand, it is the central government, for example, which collects the income tax. It is the central government which collects the corporate tax, etc. So the major bulk of taxes are collected by the central government. This tax goes in the consolidated fund of India, and from this you would talk about the sharing of revenue between center and states. So the 13th Finance Commission said that of the total revenue collected by the center, 32% must be shared with the states. And the 14th Finance Commission, which is currently in operation, had recommended this to be increased to 42%, meaning that the center must share 42% of the revenue that it collects with the states. Now this 42% of the central revenue which is shared with the states is an example of vertical distribution of the revenue, but at the or the revenue that center shares with all the states, okay, that is there. But how much of the totals, how much, or if say out of 100 crore of the revenue generated, 42 crores is to be shared with all the state, then how much of this 42 crore must go to Bihar and how much must go to Maharashtra? This is determined by the formula of horizontal distribution, and this is a formula based on 4 or 5 characters, 4 or 5 criterias which are identified by the Finance Commission: the population size, the territorial size of each of the states, etc. So horizontal distribution is to ensure parity of revenue of tax collected, parity over the distribution of tax collected between the center and the states. And so the body which ensures that every state has enough finances at its disposal is which body? The Finance Commission. Now this is there. This is the broad context that you must understand, because when you read a newspaper article, and students keep asking this all the time, that what all should we read, then the current affairs article or the newspaper articles are not making sense. We always argue that unless you understand the core of polity and economy, you'll find it difficult to make sense of many of these articles in an effective manner. Now in the current debate, there was a debate about what the CAG's report pointing out that the central government has delayed the transfer of the GST compensation cess. Now in the context of this, firstly one must understand what is a cess. See, I already told you that the Finance Commission is the one which gives the formula for the transfer of taxes collected by the center to the states. However, the finance, and this is mentioned, a Finance Commission is itself a constitutional body under Article 280, and you don't need to remember these article numbers, no need, but I'm just telling you, under Article 270 its powers are defined, and under Article 271 it is clearly written that that cess can be imposed by the central government or the state government, by the central or the state governments on their own, and this cess will not be shared on the basis of Finance Commission's reports or anything of that sort. Meaning, Finance Commission's report or recommendations have no application when it comes to sharing of cess. But then what is a cess? A cess is considered a tax which is imposed for a specific developmental purpose, and can be used only for that initiative. For example, there's a higher education cess. If there's a higher education cess imposed by the government, say on the income tax or on GST, then this tax collected in the form of higher education cess will be only used for the activities related to higher education. It cannot be spent on any other activity. It is not an untied fund, or it is a tied fund. It is a fund tied to a particular developmental requirement, and this cess is imposed by the center. Suppose if the higher education cess, and the past higher education cess was imposed by the center has in the past imposed many such cess, the Swachh Bharat cess, the Krishi Vikas cess, etc., etc. So many cess, whether it is on agriculture, on higher education, on Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, etc., have been imposed time to time, and the purpose of these sets is to address the specific developmental priorities of the government, and this is over and above the other taxes, direct and indirect taxes. The crucial point is that the cess does not, if the central government is collecting the cess, it does not need, if the central government is collecting the cess, it does not need to share, it with the states. Okay, with the states. Now it does not need to share it with the states. So that's the first point that you need to remember. And it is in this context that you see that the CAGs, and this is basically what is written in front of you has been taken from the article from Govind Rao's article in the Hindu. It's a paragraph taken from there, where basically they're pointing out the certain important features of a cess. That the cess basically is a cess that is not the cess collected is not a part of the consolidated fund of India and cannot be used for regular expenses. The transactions in that's point number one. These are the kind of points which are asked in your prelims examination, and there are almost as much as 35 cesses as of now. But the purpose of these cess is primarily to cater to a specific developmental priority. Just remember that they are not a part of the consolidated fund of India. These kind of things are also asked in your examination, especially at the prelims level. But then why were the cesses introduced? This is something also that I've just explained to you, that the government imposed these cesses to basically to finance allocation to important and priority programs. And that is one of the things. The ostensible reason for is that the apparent reason for levying these cesses is the belief that ring fencing of revenue for specific priority purposes may evoke greater tax compliances, as people can link the benefits with the taxes paid. So if you are paying an additional higher education cess, you see that your children or your relatives get access to quality higher education. The idea is that ensure that funds the collected under cess are spent only on that priority is the idea. But what has happened over time in India is a proliferation of these cesses, and even today proliferation of these cesses, and even today there are roughly 35 cesses on and off a variety of taxes over and above all other taxes which are being imposed by the government of India for various priorities. So rather than, the idea was that cess must be imposed only for few priorities at a time. But if you are imposing almost 35 cess, then it means either you have too much priorities or you are merely just trying to collect additional amount of taxes over and above which whose sharing is allowed by the consolidated fund of India and the Finance Commission's report. Actually, what is happening is that despite for the purpose for which they were introduced, today there is an important issue with imposing too many cesses. Firstly, what it does is it increases the burden of taxation on whom? It increases the burden of taxation on the people, on the taxpayer, right? And especially the salaried taxpayer in case of India. And at the same point of time, another problem with imposing too many cesses is that this complicates tax administration. It complicates tax administration primarily. Why do we say so? The idea with which, for example, one nation, one tax formula of a GST was introduced was what? That there will be only one indirect tax to pay, and that is GST. And that will be shared between center and states. But today, even over the GST, there are additional cesses being imposed. And that again defeats the purpose of simplifying the tax regime under a GST also. So it is in this context that however there are 35 cesses as of now earmarked in India, and this basically too many cesses complicate the tax system for administration and compliance costs, and also it increases the burden of taxation on people. So if this much point is clear, then we can go next as to understand about why have so many cesses being imposed. To understand why so many cesses has been imposed actually is because the central government, or why so many cesses have been imposed is primarily to basically point out that firstly the center wants to raise additional revenues, but at the same point of time the center wants to raise additional revenues that it does not need to share with the states. Now the central government actually had imposed a GST compensation cess This is where the current debate comes in. The center had imposed the GST compensation cess. This was a cess. While cess is not necessary for center to share it with the state, but the GST compensation cess was imposed primarily because in the initial years after the introduction of GST regime, the state governments were expected to suffer revenue shortfall by the introduction of the new GST regime. For the first couple of years, the states were expected to suffer revenue shortfall for 1, 2 or 3 years. And in these years, the center said that we are imposing a new cess. The tax and the cess collected here will be used specifically for compensating states who suffer from a shortfall. So this cess was ironically collected to compensate the states. But the CAG reports have pointed out that the central government has delayed the transfer of these cesses collected by over a year. And for example, out of the 46,000 crores of cess collected, GST compensation cess collected, it held on to some 40,000 crores. And that's a huge amount. Now, this is basically what is the crux of the matter. The central government has historically shied away, has historically tried to impose more and more taxes, primarily because it wants to keep or it wants to have more funds for itself. Many experts point out, like Govind Rao, that in the 13th to the 14th Finance Commission, while in the 13th to the 14th Finance Commission, while the centers increase the share of or increase the proportion or percentage of funds to be shared with the states from 32 to 42%, this increase in share of the states was happening, but at the same point of time, the center also increased the number of cesses it has been imposing. Quite simply put, in the past 10 years and also since 2014, the number of cesses being imposed. So on the one side, the center is increasing the revenue, share of the states according to the Finance Commission, but on the other side, it is imposing additional cess which it does not need to share with the states. So you see that this has been and this practice of imposing cess has been practiced for long, despite adverse comments by finance commissions that the union government has found the practice to be convenient. The Finance Commission has said that this practice of imposing cess defeats the purpose of the Finance Commission or the idea of fiscal federalism and must be avoided. But whether it is the UPA or the NDA governments, both have continued with cess. But Govind Rao also points out that in the past 7 years, the dependence on cess, the dependence of center on the cess collected has increased significantly. What does this signify? What this does signify is that the center is suffering from a revenue problem of its own, and that is why it is increasing the cess, the focus on collecting cesses. For example, they point out that as Y.V. Reddy and G.R. Reddy in their book Indian Fiscal Federalism show that the cess and surcharge constituted just about 3% of the center's gross tax in 2000-2001, but in 2015-16 it was 16.5%, and currently it could be as much as 20%, meaning from 3% in 2000 to 15% by almost 15 or 16% by almost 2015 to now almost 20% of the central funds are now coming from cess, which need not necessarily be shared with the states according to the formula of Finance Commission. Cess is also shared with the states, but not necessarily according to the formula of Finance Commission. This defeats the purpose. It also shows that the state center is becoming more and more financially dependent on the cesses which are being collected. This points to the worsening financial position of the center. Now, what we are suggesting is, what we are trying to argue is that from your examination point of view, you must know that such a over dependence of the center on cess is a negative development. Cess must be imposed, but they must be imposed only in rare cases for few priorities, not for every other so-called priority. But in the specific question of the CAG's role here, the CAG's role is to ensure accountability and to be an auditor of the government's expenditures. And the CAG pointed out that the cess specifically collected to compensate the cess specifically collected to compensate the states was largely retained by the center, and that is a problem. And this points towards the role of the CAG. CAG itself is a constitutional authority, right? And you all have may have heard about it, but the CAG's role is to probably do a number of audits. One set of audits that the CAG is supposed to do are compliance audits, and the other set of audits that it is supposed to do are the other set of audits that the CAG is supposed to do are also actually performance audits, but are actually performance audits. And we are not going to go into the details of the CAG audit, but the performance audits question about how efficiently is the government spending money. But here it is a question of compliance audit. The government is not simply releasing the money for the purpose it was allocated. And that points towards a problem in the compliance itself, and the CAG has pointed out this because it is one of these reasons that Ambedkar said that CAG is the watchdog of the democracy. It is the watchdog of democracy in the sense that it ensures accountability of the ruling government, and that is why it is such an important constitutional office. Why Ambedkar said it is one of the most important constitutional offices in independent India. Now, this is why I always argue that if you were to understand a current affairs article, you need to understand a bit of polity, a bit of economy, bring them together, and you should know the way forward. The way forward is that the central government must refrain from imposing numerous cess and must largely share revenues collected according to the recommendations of the Finance Commission, must not try to bypass the Finance Commission, and the CAG's relevance is also proved because it shows that it ensures the accountability of the ruling government at the center. So thank you all for your time and attention. You can download the PDF and the article from the links below. Thank you.